We still have a few who will be trickling in who are getting their badges, but I want to start by welcoming you all here to the Hamilton Luger School. I'm John Ciorciari. I'm the Dean of the school, and I am absolutely delighted to kick off our second annual Global and Area Perspective Symposium. As most of you know, yes, there you go. As most of you know, we created this symposium to explore key global issues and to show how area studies can shed useful or even imperative light on them. And this reflects what makes the Hamilton Luger School distinctive, its blend of regional and language studies with applied international affairs. Every year, our faculty and staff select a theme, at least every year now for 3 years. We have picked already next year's theme. And last year's theme to inaugurate was migration. This year, our faculty and staff selected a very important and timely topic that plays directly to our strengths as a school: languages, cultures, and conflict. You all know that IU is famous for language study. It teaches over 70 different languages, by most measures, top in the country. It's a special occasion in that regard because this year is the 75th anniversary of our language workshop, which began in the early 50s and quickly grew into a vital national resource, and under the leadership of Director Kathleen Evans continues to be a leader in training students and professionals, from National Guard members to others, in critical languages reflecting societies around the world. And there's no better way than to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the language workshop than to have a symposium that examines the many crucial ways in which language affects human identity, conflict, resistance, and peace-building efforts. It's also a great opportunity to celebrate someone who was long a vital part of our community, one of our leading scholars of language, the late Dr. Salman Alani, a professor in our Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures, as well as a past director of our renowned Arabic language flagship program. Dr. Alani was a remarkable scholar, a dedicated and effective instructor, and a beloved colleague who left an indelible mark on language and area studies, not just here at Indiana University, but around the country. And I would ask you to please join me in welcoming and congratulating his family members who are here in attendance to participate in the symposium with us. I'll beg your applause for another few people as well, and those are my wonderful colleagues who have done the groundwork to enable this symposium. Heather Doomling is our Director of Events and Outreach, and Ethan Hamilton is a vital member of our events team who has done so much to make this event possible. So please join me in thanking them. Thanks to their efforts, we have a great series of panels lined up with experts from a number of Indiana University departments and schools, as well as other leading universities, including Liverpool, Bradley, and the University of South Carolina. They're going to examine various ways in which language and culture intersect with conflict. We'll look, for example, at language as a tool of resistance in the Middle East and Asia later this afternoon. Tomorrow, we'll be examining language and its relationship to memory and political rhetoric in Europe, as well as a panel that examines language policy, linguistic discrimination, and ethnic conflict in various parts of the world. And last but not least, a panel focused on threats to indigenous cultures and areas of conflict. We'll also get to hear some wonderful music tonight in the atrium after the events here from our Bloomington Silk Road Ensemble, headed by our longtime faculty member, Shayar Danishkar. And they've curated a set of performances that are specifically designed for this theme and that relate to some of the societies and themes that we'll be discussing here in the Shreve Auditorium. So it should be a wonderful evening that will follow a reception before we return tomorrow for the rest of the program. But first, before we get to the panels, I'd like to welcome and have the honor of welcoming our keynote speaker, Secretary Evan Ryan. She's a distinguished public servant who, among other roles, served as White House Cabinet Secretary under President Biden, who served as Assistant Secretary of State for Educational and Cultural Affairs during the Obama administration, and earlier in her career served in various senior roles in Hillary Clinton's office during the Clinton administration. So has a perspective of having served in 3 different presidential administrations in a series of important roles, many of which relate directly to our theme today. She's also been an executive vice president of Axios and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. You can see more of her impressive biography in the program, but for present purposes, I want to emphasize that some of her diplomatic roles have put her on the front lines of issues around languages, cultures, and conflict. So she'll share some insights with me in conversation here on lessons that she's learned and on how important our symposium topic is to the world of practice. So as I invite her to come up to the stage, please join me in welcoming Secretary Ryan to the Hamilton Legal School. So thank you, Secretary Ryan. And as you know, but the audience may not since I forgot to mention it, we'll start off with some questions that I have prepared in conversation with Secretary Ryan, but we'll save plenty of time for you to share your comments and ask questions of Secretary Ryan afterwards. So welcome again to the Hamilton Lugar School. And as I've just described, this year's symposium, we're focusing on languages, cultures, and conflict, and several aspects in particular. And so I wanted to ask you a question to pick up on each of the major aspects that we're going to be covering and to draw from your experience as a diplomat who's worked in areas affected by conflict and, of course, also in the domain of cultural affairs. So the first thing is our focus on how language and culture affect the fault lines of conflict. That is to say, how they might be contributing factors in the shape that conflict takes. I wonder if you could share a few examples with us on cases you've witnessed in your career. How did languages and cultures play roles in dividing social groups and contributing to conflict or oppression? Or relatedly, how were language and culture utilized by particular groups or individuals to shape conflict?
Well, first of all, Dean, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. As you mentioned, I was at the State Department and the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs during the Obama administration, and I often say it was the best job I ever had. It was tremendous in terms of bridge building and being able to experience the power of American public diplomacy and how cultures around the world, countries around the world responded to us and how we interacted with them. So I just want to say thank you, and I applaud you for looking at this particular topic. So as you said, I've been in 3 different administrations, so there are various stops along the way that I can speak to and look at, some that I was more involved in, some less so. If you think back to the Clinton administration, the Balkans comes to mind in terms of, part of the settlement there, settling into the languages of Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia. And even though those languages are they're so closely tied. I also think more recently of what's going on over in Ukraine. There are some people who think that one of the things that Russia was paying attention to, that Putin was paying attention to, was the idea that Ukraine in 2019 decided to make Ukrainian language the official language of the country in education, in media, and society and culture. And it's one of the things that Russia responded to, we believe, in looking back at that. So language at its core, you think about this, it's the key piece of any culture, any country, and it's a key part of our humanity, right? As at the earliest stages, we're all speaking and learning languages. It's a huge part of who we are biologically. But it's also bonding, right? So you have tribes and people come together in language, people come together in culture. When people decide that they're threatened, they decide that cultures and languages can divide rather than bond people together. And that's what we see in so many places around the world. You can think back to Franco and Spain when he decided that he would outlaw the languages of the Basque and Catalan people, right? Because he wanted to make sure he was unifying the country under the language of Spanish. We think back similarly with France and Brittany and Corsica. today, you look at President Xi and how strongly he's mandated that Mandarin be the unifying national language of China. So those are some of the ways in which you can see language being used as a way to solidify, a culture, a tribe, a country together. But what that does, as we've mentioned, either when it's in the Balkans or whether you look at Russia and Ukraine in our more current times, it can also just be a tool of finding a way to clash with one another. One of the things tangentially, when I think about language, especially related to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, is, the kidnapping of so many Ukrainian children. And the intent, I think we all believe, is that they be immersed in Russian culture and Russian language. Because children are very key, right? They're so impressionable. That's where we're really learning our language, we're learning our culture, the dance, music, whatever it is that identifies us as a group. And so at this point in time, these children are immersed in Russian culture. How much are they trying to erase their Ukrainian heritage, culture, language? So that's something that you look at as a real tool of conflict in that particular case.
Thank you. And your response already begins to answer my second question, which is what happens when we reverse the causal arrow and think about how conflict can shape language and culture. And I wonder if you could comment on examples of that you've witnessed in your career.
So back in the 90s, in the Clinton administration, what comes to mind is Rwanda, and how the Hutus, when you think of, they really used powerfully language and radio to label the Tutsis. If you're hearing every day on the radio that the Tutsis are the other, they are threatening, they are cockroaches, that the language that's being used to describe them and identifying them is threatening to you, is also diminishing to them as a culture, that affects how you are going to perceive them. That affects perhaps how you're going to look at them as something to be scared of, something to, it was an impressive is the wrong word. It was a powerful tool in terms of ratcheting up the feelings of fear, the feelings of feeling like you had to defend yourself and really then go on the attack.
Yes, when you mentioned cockroaches, it reminds me of some work that I've done on Cambodia. I've studied the Khmer Rouge atrocities, and they didn't use the term cockroaches, but they used the term microbes to describe the enemies of the regime, or the purported enemies of the regime. And the Khmer words that they use to describe what you do to cockroaches is komtek, which means to smash something, like to smush a bug. And it sort of sanitizes the act. We're no longer killing people. We're just sweeping away microbes or cockroaches.
Exactly. It's something, I suppose we've confronted this throughout history, but the dehumanization. Language can be an incredible tool for dehumanizing. And just as you point out, that can then make it easier to view someone as, or a whole culture or population as not important. So then you feel it's much easier to then attack and go after and go to war and not worry about that loss of life if you've diminished them and diminished their humanity. And we see this happening all over the world in all ways, but language can be one powerful way in which we do that.
Absolutely, that power is so great. And if we look then at the other side, and we're talking thus far about language as an instrument of conflict or repression, on the flip side, our first panel is going to talk about language as resistant, language as protest, language as self-protection. What can you say about your observations of language in that vein?
Well, one thing back to the previous question before I forget is when I was in my role at the State Department, ISIS was at its prime. And we were looking at ways where we could pivot some of our programmatic money and move it over in a way that we could actually be effective against ISIS. And one of the things, I don't know if you remember when you think back to the prominence of ISIS those years ago, was they were actually using short-form video and films to recruit ISIS fighters, young men. They'd become very effective at reaching young, disenchanted men in different parts of the Muslim world. And so we thought we would try to bring aspiring filmmakers, video makers, content makers from the Arab and Muslim communities to the United States And we brought them on a program, a multi-week program, where we paired them up with United States filmmakers to teach them the best tactics and strategies we knew in terms of really attracting eyes. How do you get people to actually pay attention to your content? How is it sticky? How do you bring them in? And that program is still going on today, the Global Media Makers Program. And the intent, and it's been expanded to other parts of the world, but the intent is how can you use that culture, that language, that film language to reach people, and in the case of ISIS, to compete with what they were trying to do in that space, which was to bring young men over to this side of things.
Great, and of course, another way that language can be used for good is the language that you probably used yourself as a diplomat, which is to think about how language can be used in efforts to seek common ground and build peace. And I wonder if you could share examples in your career of that.
Absolutely. So one of the programs that I feel like did not get a lot of attention when I was at the State Department, and I'm looking at the PD officer who is here who will be familiar with this as well, there was an English language program at the Department of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the State Department. And it was really powerful, not only in terms of our ability to teach. We taught English through various programs all around the world, whether it was through Fulbright or other English language exchange programs. But what we found is that by teaching English, what we were doing was helping people, being able to expose them once they learned English to a different set of material, a different set of ideas, arguments, and values than what they had been exposed to, often in a very limited cultural environment. And one of the programs that what I found most powerful is we had an English for Imams program. And I'll always remember I visited Egypt and met with a few of the imams who'd been through our English for Imams program in Cairo. And we sat down just to discuss what their experience had been like. And at the end of it, one of the imams said to me, "Did you know that the three major religions at their core believe the same thing?" And that was because as we taught English in the English for Imams program, understanding that faith was their world, we taught that, right? We taught what Christianity was about. We taught what Hinduism, Judaism, what all of the different all of the different religions were about. It wasn't even just the three. We moved beyond that. And it was so interesting to see that in action, which was by teaching English, we were giving them an opportunity to learn different ideas, free ideas, right? That was the thought, is that we were exposing people to free ideas. And then hopefully, one of the core beliefs when we were at the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs was we were not pushing propaganda necessarily. We were trying to open ideas. We were trying to just make sure you had the ability to be exposed to different ideas and then be able to learn yourself from that.
Right, and it seems to me, we often say here in the Hamilton Luger School that what we're doing is the opposite of dehumanization, that when we learn other people's languages and cultures, we're humanizing them, understand them better. And that sounds like a powerful example of it in the program that you described.
Absolutely, and it's very hard, and this can be, we can apply this in any aspects of our lives today. It's very hard to hate someone who you can understand and sit and converse with, right? If you hear that idea, you understand their perspective and where they're coming from, it makes it much more difficult. At the very least, what it does is give you a sense of why they believe what they believe. And that helps maybe calm waters down. It helps bring temperatures down. And it's a really powerful, important piece of this. But when you look just across our world today, and I don't know how much of this is also attributed to the dominance of social media and the ability of how interconnected we are, but it's very easy to dehumanize. So anytime we do have that opportunity, it's really helpful.
That's great. And you had mentioned the very successful program that you were involved in the State Department. Have you observed civil society organizations, private firms, others that have been particularly effective in this space that you think are making important strides toward mutual understanding through language and cultural education?
So many years ago, when I left the Clinton administration, a friend of mine was starting an NGO that has really thrived. It's called Peace Players International. And the idea behind it is to teach basketball to children of different races, religions, or ethnicities. And they started off in Northern Ireland, and then they moved to South Africa, and then they moved to Israel and the Palestinian territories, and they're still operating in all of those areas today. And I joined their board and helped them get off the ground. And it's bittersweet, to be honest, because the idea behind it, I thought, was really smart. Reach children. Teach them a sport they're not familiar with. Teach them a sport that is not endemic to their culture. So it's something that is not associated with one particular part of a culture, because these are all divided societies, right? So in each of these cases, in each of these countries or geographical areas, no one really owned basketball. And so they were able to come in and teach children, and they really looked specifically and did some research to figure out what age groups were the age groups to really try to target. And they did it smartly, and they thought, if before you hit the teenage years, children are open. And what they found is that even if children are at home, hearing their parents perhaps characterize a different culture or tribe a certain way, really in those preteen years, they're still open, and they're gonna make their own decisions. So then if you put them on a basketball court, and what they did, it wasn't like playing one against the other, they integrated the teams, right? So you had, the Protestants and the Catholics playing together on a team in Northern Ireland, and the same, with Palestinians and young Israelis playing together on teams and learning together. And they found it was really effective in being able to have those children see, okay, I've been at my house, and my parents have told me I should hate you. But here on this basketball court, you are my friend. And I see you in a more human form and in a different way. And it was funny, by the time I got to the State Department, they had really established themselves in such a way that predating me, they were receiving grants from the State Department to operate in those places that I mentioned and to go and beyond. But right now, I would say, because I'm a big believer in public diplomacy and the programs that we had at the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, but a lot of cuts are happening. So to your point, Dean, it's more important than ever that civil society and NGOs are empowered, are well-funded, and are able to step into many of these spaces where it's so crucial that we continue to build bridges and reach out and help people understand another person's culture, language, or background.
Well, there's a wonderful example, and the power of sports as a cultural practice that can unite people. It reminds me of the integration of football teams in Northern Virginia, near where you now live, or the Springboks in South Africa in the 1990s. And of course, in the state of Indiana, anything surrounding basketball will be a popular initiative.
Exactly.
I'd like to ask one more question of Secretary Ryan, but please be thinking of the comments and questions that you all would like to share in a moment. And the last thing that I have on my list is to ask you, based on your experience in the world of practice, what forms of research do you think are the most important for people in a scholarly community like this to be pursuing?
I think, when we think about culture and language and the power of culture and language, which I clearly believe strongly in, I do think history repeats itself. I think looking at the Cold War and the United States deciding to send, jazz ambassadors, that was the beginning, really, of a lot of the bureau that I ended up working in. That was the beginning of that, right? Were the jazz ambassadors. It was very powerful. And then you found the Soviet Union following that lead, and through whether it be through ballet or other cultural programs. So I would say looking at the history, looking at ping pong diplomacy in China way back during Nixon. I remember when I worked for President Biden when he was vice president, he went to China. He and she had a back and forth, and he went to China, and he and she went to a basketball game when they were there. And so it really is looking at where do you have, and we've seen this throughout history, where do you have the opportunity to take away some of the intensity of maybe perhaps a diplomatic interaction that is not going well. And that's what the State Department has done so effectively through the programs that I've mentioned. Oftentimes what they would do through history with the ECA programs was start to send them first right? Let's see what we can do first through some of these cultural programs, through enabling English to be taught. And then by enabling English to be taught in these areas, for instance, to go back to that, what we found also is once we taught English in some of these areas, first of all, it helped, as I'd mentioned, the other program, but it helped in terms of areas where people were radicalized. Then they were able to learn English as a different language, which opened up the internet for them. They could be exposed to different things. But we also found, once we taught English, that it opened up entrepreneurship. We used to run entrepreneur exchange programs where we would bring people here and help them learn how to start a business, how to build a business. That's uniquely American. So I would just say, for all of you studying international affairs, that's why I do say I'm so glad you're doing this. It's often not looked at enough, language and culture and the power. It certainly is utilized in conflict often enough, so why don't we use it in the power of good more often as well? But I would say I think there are real examples throughout history of ways that we as the United States have used it effectively through these programs.
Well, thank you for that. And let me now turn to our audience. Yes, absolutely, thank you. Let me turn to our audience. I see that we have a few folks here who have microphones, so please raise your hand and they'll bring you a microphone. It would be wonderful if you could stand up and tell us who you are and then ask your question or share your comment.
Oof. Hello there, my name is Shrikar Vasan. I'm a student here at the Hamilton Luger School. Thank you for your conversation, Secretary Ryan and Dean Chorchiari. You mentioned how the use of English can open up new opportunities and expose people to new cultures. I've heard from some about the concern that in a globalized world, that initiatives that expose people to this culture and expose people to these languages pose threats to the preservation of indigenous cultures and indigenous languages. How do you strike that balance between those two goals? Is there a balance, and what is it? Thank you.
That's an excellent question, and you're 100% right. It's something that I actually did not touch on here, so I'm so glad you asked. But one of the things that we also tried to highlight was how we as the United States could show our respect to countries, cultures around the world by saying, we respect your history, your background, your culture. I will say that we did not focus as much on language preservation as we did on structural preservation of historic structures. So we actually had a department within the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs that was the Cultural Heritage Preservation Department. It was amazing. It was also, again, did not get a lot of attention, a little known tool, but what I often would say to people is it was the equivalent of arriving in a country, seeing that something was in disrepair, and it was of great importance to them for their history, and saying to them, well, we, the United States, would like to pay to preserve this for you. And oh my gosh, the responses we would get for that was just amazing. And I often said, well, I understand that, because I thought I was so fortunate when I worked at the State Department, I had an office that overlooked the Lincoln Memorial. And I often would say, what if a country arrived in the United States and said, wow, it looks like the Lincoln Memorial needs to be repaired and preserved. Could we do that for you? It's incredibly powerful. So while I can't say that we spent as much time on helping, I think what I could say is when I traveled around the world, when our ambassadors are obviously in country, I think we all would put a big focus on wanting to experience the language, culture, in every respect, whether that is the dress, the food, the dance, the music. We would want to show our respect and try to immerse ourselves in that. But I can't say that from a language perspective. It's a really good question. We tended to focus on English.
Thank you very much, Secretary Ryan. I have a question also related to English. So when you mentioned language in general in the beginning, the line I remember is that language can serve as a tool for bonding, but sometimes it can also serve as a tool for division. When you talk about the role of English, you did mention that it's exposing people to a different set of material and it's about free ideas. It seems like English is playing a very unique role vis-a-vis conflicts and general lines of division. So my question is, first of all, specifically, do you see instances where English plays this similar role of division as other languages do? And secondly, more broadly, if English is indeed unique in that aspect, what do you think contributes to this unique status of English? Thank you very much.
And you mean, is it unique in being more of a unifying language than a divisive? Like, if that's my belief.
Yes, serving as a channel to expose people to free ideas.
Yes. I feel biased in my answer, so I will admit that up front, but I do, having worked for those years on the English language programs, and you know, there was one young woman who I met who'd been through one of our English language programs, and she was from Tunisia, and she now spoke fluent English, and I had the opportunity to meet her, and she said to me, "You don't understand. I now know English. I feel like I've been able to climb to the top of a tall tree and now see and understand the world." And that made a lot of sense to me, because it's the language of business, it's the language, it's the language a lot of people do aspire to if they want to come study in the United States. So I do find it more of a unifier, in my view, than divisive. That's what I would say. I think it's very interesting. To the previous question, it is important that we respect people's heritage and language and background. My hope is that there's a way to do both. But so far, in terms of my experience, I found it to be unifying. And what do I think contributes to that? I think what contributes to that is the idea that here we're on a university campus. So many students from around the world want to study in the United States. So many businesses want to establish themselves in the United States. So it still is, the United States, a shiny city on a hill that people do look towards. So I think that's why English can be the entry point for them, and that's, I think, why it is.
Hello, my name is Celine Yang. I'm currently a sophomore studying international studies and East Asian languages and cultures. And I have a question regarding language preservation. My family is from Taiwan, and I am part of a generation where I can see that language being lost, the traditional language of Hokkien, between my peers and even myself. And I was wondering what I can do personally to protect that culture and language, and what is the fine line between preservation and acceptance of a dying language? Thank you.
Oh, that is such a tough one. First, I just want to say I appreciate that you and your family, and that this is a focus for you, and that you're looking at this. I would say, when you are trying to think of how you, as a Taiwan, how you can actually look at this, is when technology and social media and the reach of technology can play in your favor. Connecting with other people who feel the same way that you do, who want to make sure that the Taiwanese language is preserved. Finding ways to do that online, I would say, is probably a good thought. But then also, you've got the tremendous advantage of being at a school that really focuses on this, and are there people here who you could connect with? Are there people here who might be interested in learning about, Taiwanese language and culture? That's a really tough one, and I really respect that you're looking at that, and I'm glad that you are. I hope that there's a way to preserve that. And I think a lot of that comes down to family too, right? And making sure so much of language and culture, is passed down, right, through generations. And making sure that this is something that you yourself continue, and that you highlight and emphasize to your friends and family members who feel similarly, I would say. would be important as well. But I wish you all the best because that's important.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for the very insightful conversation, Secretary Ryan. I'm a sophomore here at HLS, and my question is in regards to a point you mentioned, which is the importance of cultural and linguistic preservation and kind of this intent and mission to spread what you call free ideas rather than the idea of imposing propaganda. How would you point to any instances of this mission and this intent being reflected in the kind of design of the processes and the institutions that are behind some of the programs you've spoken about? And are there any kind of threats to that mission that you would identify? Thank you.
I just want to make sure I understood the question correctly. So are you saying the programs within the bureau that I ran, were they propaganda focused?
Could you speak about some of the implementation of that intent?
Oh, I see. Yes.
yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you. I can. So we ran so many programs, hundreds of programs, and so we would constantly have people coming from around the world to the United States, and at our embassies around the world constantly are interacting with people in those countries. And part of being trained as a public diplomacy officer, part of understanding our programs was to say, you know, that we're not preaching, we are exposing. We are opening, we're giving tools and opportunities, but I think it was something and probably, possibly a vestige of the Cold War in deciding actively that we were not going to be propaganda focused, and instead we were going to be about exposing people to this world, to the United States, to our language, to our culture. I'll give one example of that I always remember and think of. So we did, any of the people who were implementing our programs, who were shepherding our exchange program participants here in the United States, knew that this was about answering questions, but it was not about pushing any particular line of propaganda. And we had a program where we brought soccer coaches from the Middle East to the United States. And one of the soccer coaches who arrived said to the program officer, you know, I hate the United States, and I came for the free trip. And I am like, you're horrible. It was a 2-week program, and by the end of the program, he went up to the program officer and said, how can I stay? What can I do? I want to be here. And that's with no propaganda. What it is, all of a sudden, being in a place and in a hotel room where you see on TV people actively attacking the President of the United States because they can, because freedom of speech is a value here that we hold dear. And so it's just exposure by basically just being here, by going in and realizing that businesses are thriving and you can walk in and probably find anything you want at any particular store, and just the variety and the possibilities are endless. And so that sense of possibility, abundance, innovation, it just reverberates when you're here in the United States. And I think it especially reverberates in contrast to many people who are coming from places that don't have those opportunities. And so it's a long way of saying we did not need to use propaganda. We really actively made sure people did not push anything along those lines, because what's just amazing is how much the United States speaks for itself.
Hey, I'm Casey. I'm majoring in cybersecurity and global policy here, and thank you for being here today. And I was wondering if you have experienced like any competition with countries like Russia or China trying to interfere or make a change to your agenda or or what the U.S. is trying to achieve and expose everybody.
That's such a good question. Yes. So during my time at the State Department, so that was during the second term of Obama, I had a good relationship with my counterpart in China, and Secretary Kerry oversaw a public diplomacy dialogue with China that we found to be very effective. We did run into roadblocks, though, that we found. For instance, we were very open, because we are, about Confucius Institutes, which are Chinese language institutes here in the United States. And they were thriving and doing quite well here. And we weren't stopping it, right? Like, they were proliferating all over the United States. Now, Meanwhile, what we were seeing more and more of in China was US embassy speakers scheduled to speak in a certain province in China and getting canceled. And so that was a big part of what we discussed in our dialogue with China, is just we were seeing less and less reciprocity in terms of goodwill and being able to work with each other. And I have to say, I don't know the latest in the status of the Confucius Institute today and how that has played out. It's now something I'm thinking I'd like to look at and see. But for me, the dialogue was very important to us. It was something Secretary Kerry spent a lot of time on. And we really felt like we were making headway in some ways. And then I remember we hit this place where it became a real dilemma. And the dilemma for us, as you can imagine, was we are an open society. It's hypocritical, honestly, to then try to shut these places down. So what, how are we going to approach this? What are we going to do? And that's ultimately what we decided, is that we are an open society. We're not going to try to shut these places down, but that we were going to keep just trying to press forward with China and being able to make sure that we could operate programs, speakers, and hence you did see Vice President Biden go over there, and culture was a component of what he did, because that was something that we thought could help strengthen the connection there. But China in particular, during my time there, during my time there, in terms of Russia, we had a real concerted effort for the countries right around Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia. We really stepped up our programming there, because this was around the time of Georgia and some other stuff. So we really stepped up our programming to make sure. In that regard, what we were trying to do is make sure that the people in those countries felt a strong connection to the United States. They felt that they were connected to us. They weren't only language programs. We brought those people from those areas over and sent them to Silicon Valley so that they could learn how to compete with Russia from, like a digital propaganda perspective, frankly. That's what we did there, and then make them feel like they had a close relationship with the United States. But I remember in that regard is really trying to give tools to the countries right around Russia and make sure that they felt capable of standing up to them, because Russia is so big on propaganda from a propaganda perspective.
That's very interesting, because back to the theme of language and conflict, the Russian government has often used the rationale of protecting Russian speakers in adjacent countries from the majority population.
Exactly, yeah.
Let's see what other questions we have. I see there's one here in front of Elena.
Thank you. Thank you for this amazing session. It's very thought-provoking. And my name is Oner. I'm a linguist and a professor in the Central Eurasian Studies Department. I'm glad that you talked about language as bonding, at the same time doing the opposite, right? But it also depends, of course, on the definition of language, and also, at the micro level, it's usually bonding, right? So I'm glad you gave the Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian example, because you can see in that same example the language functioning as bonding, for example, in Yugoslavia, to create that unity, but at the same time separating those different identities at the level of individual countries. But at that level, it's also bonding, right? Yeah. So they are defining their own unity as a nation state. And I'm also glad you mentioned your view on English as a unifying language. I completely agree. I think it's, as a lingua franca, it's unifying at the international level. And in fact, I believe all languages are, for that reason, mostly unifying, even though you can see on the surface that divisive outcomes as well, but only on the surface. I was just wondering, at the super micro level, because I noticed, I speak bits and pieces of several languages, and when I see people from those cultures and when I speak to them, even a single word or two words, it really functions, it creates solidarity, it creates so many positive effects. So I wonder if you have had any such experiences of colleagues speaking just maybe a single word or a couple of words in the language, in the target language, and creating an impact they would otherwise not be able to create. Can you give some examples of those?
Absolutely. A couple I can think of, but I think you're absolutely right. I think the idea, I feel like I felt it as well from a different perspective. If I traveled to another country that was not an English-speaking country, but they started off by saying hello or how are you or something like that, the effort involved in that was a real connector. You know what I mean? We've had a few secretaries who speak fluently in another language, and I think that's been enormously helpful. In terms of, I'm trying to remember, and part of it is just that it was long ago, so I don't know if I can come up with that specific example, but I believe you're absolutely right. I think there's something about the effort put into even just an initial greeting. You know what, the other thing that I found, and this happens I think often in diplomacy because of what English is, you will often find yourself across the table from a counterpart who actually does understand English, but they're not speaking it because it's buying them some time with a translator. There were many instances where we happened to know that the person did speak English, but they did not choose to speak English, and we always would joke, it bought them some time, right? Because you had the buffer of the translator as well. But I agree, I think it's such a goodwill gesture to show that effort to try to speak another language. You know, there's little things too. I remember in China with my counterpart telling her about the meal I'd had the night before. And, you know, the parts of it that I liked, and she loved that. So I think there are all these ways, these touch points, language, culture, that through the tiniest bit of effort can really amount to something. And it's interesting, I mean, it just makes me think of something else, which is just the cultural differences, you know, because I'm just thinking about that one China interaction. You know, depending on where you are in the world as a diplomat, people are going to receive what you're saying, perhaps, and take you quite literally. And sometimes you might be, as an American, saying things casually in conversation before you get to your official part of your meeting, and then you'll find out later that casual beginning of the conversation where you happen to say something about the weather not being good, they interpret it as you being critical, you know, of their country or something. So it's interesting. There are many layers to all of this when it comes to language and to culture.
Your comment about when you're sitting across the table from an interpreter
Yeah.
and your counterpart reminded me of something. I witnessed this in there when I was in those situations. If I said a few words in the language of the person to whom I was speaking, that person would respond looking at my eyes, not at the interpreter.
Yeah.
And it really makes a difference, right?
Yes.
It's back to this humanization.
It is.
I now have some connection with you, however ephemeral,
Exactly.
that, or however minor,
Exactly.
that now I want to look at you instead of looking at the person who can understand me.
Completely, yes.
Hello, my name is Francie. I am our current interim director of the Language Training Center, which is our collaboration with the Special Forces. So in that capacity, earlier I was teaching German to the Special Forces. And I'm flipping the coin right now because you spoke about building bridges by bringing English to other cultures or to other countries, but we haven't really talked about, like, we have many people here who bring culture and language to your country, to these United States. We're here to share, and we're here to bring something to show you what the other side is. Like, the world has recognized that English is the lingua franca, and we're all learning it. But when I taught German, they discontinued the program with the words, well, they all speak English. We go over there and we work with them together. Our special forces work with your special forces. But the argument was, they all speak English over there. We don't need to learn German. They let every single German instructor go over there. So for me, the question that I want to ask is, what is the general tenor in Washington? And this was not the current administration, this was the previous administration. In all the administrations, what is the value of us bringing culture and language here, the other side of this bridge? Thank you.
I think that's such an important point. And what I will say is, through the educational and cultural programs, first of all, it's such an important point because one of the things that I think your question brings to mind is It's a detriment to the United States, to our culture, to our children, if they are missing out on the opportunity to learn more about the German language, the German culture, anything along those lines. So all of them, right, no, just use an example, but yes, but I agree, all of them. I mean, it makes me think back to the earlier question about Taiwan. I mean, it's really important that all of these cultures, these global languages, cultures, that they remain strong and vibrant, because there's so much wrapped around history and identity and pride that should be embraced. But I do think, to your question, you make an excellent point, which is, how much are we missing out in the United States when this is not something that is emphasized because of the lingua franca and because of the prominence? We did have programs, absolutely, in the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, where we brought people here from around the world, and really, they would come here, and especially when I think of Fulbright or other programs, part of that was so that we could learn their culture, their background, their identity, their history, and they could really bring that here. Many Fulbrighters who are here teaching in universities, their languages, their cultures, and their histories. But it's something we should all think about as Americans individually, beyond the State Department, which obviously has that mandate of understanding and bridging and connecting with other cultures and languages. The example you used with the German Special Forces is a really good example. I think it's unfortunate. It would be wonderful if the US Special Forces who were there walked away understanding German, at least more. So that's something that we should think about. We should in the United States culturally, and it's important to find ways to make sure that we in the United States are honoring and supporting other languages and cultures as well.
Oh, yes, we'll come to you next.
Hi, I'm Gardner. I'm a permanent student at IU. They also let me teach here. You're probably aware that the political tenor of the current administration is a little bit different from the ones you served. You've worked with elected officials. You've also worked in the foreign policy and diplomatic arm of the US government. I wonder what you think and what the people you worked with would think of the argument that funding programs like the ones at IU to teach American students to do another thing after they've gotten help from people who visit here, go abroad, learn languages and go abroad. Whether it is true, that is not in the national interest of the United States. That's too much money to spend, it's money wasted, and so forth. What would you and your interlocutors have said if someone had proposed that logic?
Well, let me start by saying I have a 6-year-old and a 5-year-old who are learning Spanish weekly, and that's something that we are focusing on from a very young age. And then my goal is to introduce other languages later. I think through my work and my experience, I would love for them to be multilingual. I think it's hugely important. I think that it would make them citizens of the world in a way that is going to be crucial in the decades ahead. No, I think that, we ran programs in the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs where you qualified if you were proficient in the language. As a US student, you would not be able to get the Fulbright or the scholarship for the particular area that you wanted to go and study in unless you walked in proficient in that language. We had high school exchange programs at the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs where high school students could spend a summer in Jordan or Morocco learning Arabic. And then that would, later on, they'd be able to either study in college over in an Arabic-speaking country. So I think you're absolutely right. It's crucial that we continue to prioritize language learning in this country and make sure that we are not cutting ourselves off from around the world. And even with the dominance of English, that there's a way to, not everyone has access to it, that there's a way to really be global. And we can't be a global country if we don't have that ability. And other countries will be at an advantage because other countries not only will be native speaking, but will understand English. We will be limited. So those language programs, what you do here is really crucial and really important, and I hope it continues.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and our guest in the front row here will be asking it.
Hi. I am Marge. I've got a background in folklore and cultural anthropology, But how does one, first of all, what is the status of the program that you are currently, or that you have been overseeing? Has that been dismantled? And that's number one. And number two, how does one counter the tendencies, the current tendencies towards American insularity? Thank you.
So on the first question, the proposed budget that went to Capitol Hill cut a lot, cut a great deal. I don't know where it will land and how it will come out. My hope is, and my experience, I have to say, from my time when I was there, when I was going through my Senate confirmation hearing, I quoted Senator Lindsey Graham, who called the programs that I was about to hopefully oversee the lifeblood of American diplomacy. They really are foundational, you know, those programs and those connections. So I relished the opportunity to quote him in my testimony. And I should say, through my 4 years there, he was a huge supporter. He remained a very big supporter. It was amazing. That's why, as a caveat to your first part of your question, I'm somewhat hopeful, because what I found time and again is that the programs that I ran at the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs were very popular from a bipartisan perspective. Both Republicans and Democrats understood their utility. They wanted to make sure they were preserved. They had a lot of support on both sides of the aisle. So I'm hopeful that it will get to a better place. And now I'm forgetting, I apologize, the second part of the question.
American insularity.
Oh, yes. I would argue and say that perhaps it's a bigger threat right now than ever. And my hope is that we find ways as a culture to continue to embrace, to want to learn about other countries' cultures, histories, and heritages. But right now, it feels a little bleak, American insularity. And I look at that when I see how Europe must feel today versus a year or so ago about the partnership that we had in support. I personally believe that American alliances and American work around the world from a foreign aid perspective were critical and important and lifted us up globally. And it's something that we should continue to prioritize, and I hope we can find a way to.
Well, thank you. That brings us to the end of our. Please join me in thanking Secretary Ryan for some really great insights. Thank you.